In this lecture, we're going to talk about basic concepts of engineering economy. In particular, we're going to cover 4 topics. We're first going to talk about the focus of the course. I will then take you through 3 illustrative problems to give you a flavor of the kinds of things we'll be talking about in this course. I'll then cover the course objectives. And finally, we're going to talk about 4 basic principles of engineering economy. Course focus. This course is focused on the principles and procedures for making sound economic decisions. That's the focus of the course. This course is likely to be unlike any other course that you may have had. A number of you may not have had many courses dealing with economic principles and economic thoughts and ideas. In that sense, this will be a different course for you. Many of you, on the other hand, may have had a course in, say, micro or macroeconomics, maybe even business finance or accounting, cost accounting or financial accounting. Many of the things we'll be talking about in this course will sound familiar to you. We'll be using certain terminology that you may have heard in these other related courses. But again, this course will still be different from those other economics-related courses. This course is focused on making sound economic decisions. This is not a course about broad economic policy. This is a course about making decisions on a day-to-day basis. When faced with choices, how does one decide what is the most economical course of action? What I'd like to do now is to take you through 3 very simple examples to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we'll be talking about in this course. These 3 illustrative problems are all real problems. They are problems which I have selected, which you ought to have some familiarity at this point. Let's talk about the first one. This is one that appeared not long ago as a newspaper headline. $1 million jackpot turns sour. Lotto winner kept from selling part of prize and sues. Now, what this problem was about was the following. An individual had won a state lottery, and that individual had won $1 million. What they had won was $50,000 a year for the next 20 years. As you probably know, when a lotto winner wins in a lotto jackpot, the state typically does not pay it out all as one lump sum. You tend to get it in increments over a period of time, and in this case, it was $50,000 a year for 20 years. After taxes, that is, once Uncle Sam and the governor had taken their share of the profits, what the lotto winner would actually receive as a check would be $36,000 a year for the next 20 years. Now, this particular winner was approached by a company, and they gave this particular lotto winner the following opportunity. If the lotto winner would sign over to this company the first 10 years' worth of earnings, they would give to that lotto winner today as a lump sum after taxes, that is, the company would pay for all taxes, they would give to this winner a check for $241,000 now. Now, the lotto winner gets to keep the last 10 years, that is, from time 11 through time 20 of the earnings. But what they were interested in was him signing over the first 10 years' worth of winnings. Now, as it turns out, in this particular case, the state precluded this deal from happening. However, it raised some very interesting ideas and concepts related to an engineering economy decision. What if you were this lotto winner? What if, in fact, the state did not stand in the way and said, fine, if you'd like to sign over the next 10 years of earnings to someone else, go right ahead. What if you had this $1 million in earnings, $36,000 a year after taxes for the next 20 years, and a company approached you and said, if you'll give us the first 10 years worth of earnings, we will give you a check for $241,000. Would you take that deal? There's some trade-offs obviously involved here. For example, if I decide not to take the deal, I will get my earnings, my winnings, in increments of time each year for the next 20 years. And there's some issues involved there. For example, inflation. I will get $36,000 unadjusted for inflation every year. Now, inflation, even at a low rate of inflation every year, after 20 years begins to add up. Here, I'm not faced quite so much with that problem. Here, I get the cash right up front. What would I do with $241,000? I suspect most of us, your thoughts would turn to things like, gee, maybe I should get a nice new fancy car, or maybe an exotic trip somewhere around the world. But you could also invest those funds. You could also invest the $36,000 a year. You'll just have smaller amounts of it, and you have to wait each year to get those funds to invest them. Whereas in this case, you get $241,000 up front. Now, you get less than the total amount you would get over 10 years. I mean, the total amount you're giving up is $360,000 for the privilege of having $241,000 today. By the end of this course, we will go through the principles and the procedures such that you could do an economic analysis on this opportunity and make a sound economic decision as to whether or not this trade-off is a wise investment. Let's take another, again, simple example, just to illustrate some of the notions about making economic decisions. An automobile insurance company offers customers the opportunity to either pay 6 months' worth of insurance now, pay it all up front, or you can pay half of it now and half of it in 60 days. But for the privilege of delaying half of that payment 60 days into the future, they're going to charge you a service fee of $5 today. In other words, what you would do is pay half now plus $5 and half in 60 days. If the premium was $150, would you take them up on their offer? Now, at this point, you probably don't readily recognize it, but what this automobile insurance company has offered you is a loan. They've offered you the opportunity to save a certain amount today. In particular, you would have to pay either $150 today, or you would have to pay half of it, $75, plus a $5 service fee. So you would have to pay $80 today, meaning you would save $70 by taking their deal, but you've got to pay $75 60 days from now. That savings of $70 today is in effect a loan to you. They're loaning you funds for which you have to then pay them in 60 days $75. Is that an economical choice? Let's take one more example. Again, a real problem. A colleague approached me not too long ago. He'd been out shopping for a car. And he got to the point where he was negotiating the purchase of this car with a salesperson, and the salesperson asked him, are you going to pay cash or are you going to finance the car? And his immediate answer was, oh, I'm going to pay cash. And the salesperson said, well, let me share something with you. We have an opportunity for you that I think you ought to consider. He said, you know, it may in fact cost you more to pay cash than to finance this car. And he turned around and he entered some numbers into a computer terminal, and that computer then provided the following analysis for which the salesperson went through this description. The salesperson said there is a cost of paying cash. If you take, for example, $10,000, and I don't know what my colleague was going to pay for this automobile, but the salesperson used $10,000 in the example. If you were to pay $10,000 and invest it in this car, you will not have the opportunity to, in fact, invest those funds, say, in the money market, where you can presently earn, at that time, 6.5% per year. The salesperson went on to say, over the course of 48 months, or 4 years, you would give up the opportunity to have interest of $2,960.20. Alternatively, the salesperson went on, you can finance this car. If you were to borrow $10,000 from us, at an annual percentage rate, APR stands for annual percentage rate, of 10.5% per year for the next 48 months or 4 years, the total interest you would pay over that 4-year period is $2,289.44. The salesperson therefore concluded you would save $670.76 to finance the car rather than pay cash. Now, even at this point in the course, this ought to strike you as a rather interesting analysis. Does it make intuitive sense to you that you could borrow money at 10.5%, whereas alternatively you could invest at only 6.5% and you would actually save money? All of these numbers are verifiable in the sense that there was no calculation error that the salesperson did in producing these numbers. We can reproduce the calculations the salesperson went through to get these numbers. The problem lies in the logic, the principles that the salesperson followed in reaching the conclusion that the salesperson reached. Let's talk about the course objectives. The objectives of this course are the following: for you to be able to make wise economic decisions, and in particular, we want you to be proficient in comparing alternatives. Each of those 3 examples that I just shared with you involve alternatives, that is, choices. We want you to be proficient in identifying and comparing those alternatives. We want you to be able to see and assess trade-offs. All of those examples involve trade-offs. We want you to be able to evaluate the justifications prepared by others. And my last example of the salesperson is a perfect example of that. There will be lots of times in professional practice when you'll be presented analyses done by others, and you'll need to be able to evaluate what they have done to see if they've in fact followed proper principles and procedures. We want you to be comfortable in using financial language, and we'll be using a fair amount in this course. We want you to be comfortable in understanding the use of that language. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we want you to be glad that you took this course. Every subject matter has its basic, fundamental concepts, ideas, principles. This course is certainly no different. There are 4 basic principles in engineering economy. We'll be covering a number of other additional principles as we go through the course, but this is sort of the foundation set. Now, I'm going to present these in no particular order. In other words, the first one I'm going to share with you is not the most important, and the second one, the second most important. They're all equally important. The first principle: an economic decision is no better than the alternatives considered. We're going to be sharing with you principles and procedures for making sound economic decisions. Now, those principles and those procedures can only help you choose from among the alternatives that you identify. None of these principles or procedures can help you make a choice of an alternative you didn't consider. For example, in the case of the problem dealing with the automobile loan, that is, the automobile dealer was going to provide an opportunity to finance that car. We can go through an analysis using the data that I provided you to determine whether or not that opportunity that the salesperson presented to my colleague is an economical course of action. What these principles and procedures cannot do is to decide whether or not perhaps it might be even smarter, even more economical, not to take the automobile's salesperson's offer, but instead go to a local bank and finance it. These procedures and principles are only as good as the alternatives that you begin with. So it's important at the beginning of an engineering economy study to think carefully about what are the possible alternative courses of action. Don't worry about whether or not they may ultimately prove to be economical or not. What's important up front is to at least identify them. You'll need to spend enough time to be comfortable that you've identified those courses of action which seem to be the most obvious courses of action. But you're certainly encouraged to spend a little extra time thinking about perhaps some creative alternatives that may in fact prove to be a wise choice. Alternatives. That's a word we will use a lot of in this course. Alternative simply means a choice among two or more things. You can choose course of action A, or you can choose course of action B or C. It's a choice. You must choose one or the other. Now, sometimes these choices are pretty obvious, and sometimes they're not. Let's assume that you were an engineer working for a manufacturing corporation. Let's also assume that you had a piece of equipment on the manufacturing floor that was producing off-quality product, causing all manner of disturbance in the flow of product as it moved down the line. It should become readily clear after a while that that is an alternative, that is an opportunity that needs attention. You need to do something about that particular piece of equipment. But there may be cases where it's not quite so obvious. You may be having a manufacturing line that's in fact producing high-quality product. The product is profitable, you're making money, things are working just fine. What you may not know is that perhaps new technology has been introduced which would enhance the quality or improve the efficiency of the line. That is an alternative or an opportunity for which you must seek it out. Sometimes it'll be obvious, and sometimes it will not. One possible choice to bear in mind in many problems, not in all cases, is the do-nothing alternative. And by do-nothing, we basically mean sometimes what you're doing now is indeed the most appropriate course of action. So bear in mind, just because there are alternative choices of doing things differently, sometimes doing what you're doing now is the most appropriate course of action. Second principle. An economic decision is no better than the forecasts describing each alternative. Basically what this says is the data that you're working with is going to determine the quality of the decision you make. The decision can be no better than the accuracy of the information that describes each alternative. Forecasting is not easy. In this course, we're talking about economic decisions. Decisions can only affect future consequences, and forecasting those future consequences can be rather difficult at times. It's not an easy activity to do. You need to bear in mind that in evaluating these alternatives and describing them, some of the information is what we call certain information. That is, you have a great deal of more comfortable confidence, certainty about what that precise number is going to be. If I take out a loan, we will sign a contract as to the amount and the timing at which I must make those payments. That would be an example of certain cash flows. The bank has very certain expectations of what they expect to receive from me and when. But other elements may be very uncertain. Trying to forecast the revenues that we might earn on a new product often is very uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the amount of those cash flows may be, as well as the timing of those cash flows. In this course, we'll talk about both situations. Early in the course, we're going to be focusing primarily on certainty. That is, we will assume that the information provided is reasonably well known. Later in the course, then, we'll show you how to deal with a situation where, in fact, your level of comfort, the degree of certainty, is much more uncertain as to what the cash flow future looks like. Bear in mind, when we talk about describing the forecasts of consequences related to each alternative, we're talking about both the monetary consequences as well as the non-monetary consequences. These are both important elements. With respect to the monetary consequences, we will talk in terms of the amount of cash flow, but also the timing. And in fact, in this course, we will spend a lot of time talking not so much about the amount of funds involved, but the timing of those funds. And in fact, in the three examples that I just gave you, the solution to those examples, that is to reach a sound economic decision, requires that one take into account very explicitly what the timing of those cash flow consequences are associated with each of those alternatives. Third basic principle. An economic decision should be based on the differences among alternatives. It's the differences between choices that will influence you as to what course of action you wish to take. A corollary, if you will, to this principle is all that is common is irrelevant to the decision. Let's assume that you had decided to purchase a new car. You had decided on the type, the make, you had decided on all of the particular elements that you want to have in that car in terms of a CD player, the size of the engine, whether it's to be a standard or an automatic. You decided all of that. And you're looking at two automobiles now, totally identical in every respect, except one happens to be red and the other one happens to be blue. Same price, same everything, one's red, one's blue. In the choice between those two automobiles, what will influence your decision, the only thing that will influence your decision in the choice between those two automobiles can only be the color, because everything else is the same. All that is common to a decision is irrelevant. What that means is the past is irrelevant to any decision I make today. One exception, except as a guide to predict future events. Think of it this way. If I make a decision today, in no way can that decision today change history. What's done is done. There is nothing I can do today to change the past. The past is common to any particular course of action I change today. Because it is common, it's irrelevant. Now, the past may be helpful to me in predicting what I think future events may be. That certainly is helpful. But in the decision, ultimately, what choice, what course of action I go will depend on the differences between those alternatives. This concept is sometimes known as a sunk cost, that the past is irrelevant. It's common to any course of action I could choose today. The fourth basic principle. An economic decision should be based on the objective of making the best use of limited resources. Now, you'll notice I put the word best here. I sort of put parentheses around that, quote marks, to indicate that sometimes the best use of those resources involves a trade-off between the monetary and the non-monetary consequences. Bear in mind we must take into account both. I would also emphasize that in the vast majority of cases you're going to be dealing with limited resources. There's many, many situations in practice where there's not sufficient resources to cover all of the possible alternative courses of action. And so you're going to have to make a choice between the monetary and the non-monetary consequences, taking into account limited resources. Let's summarize what we've covered in this lecture. We talked about the focus of this course. It's to help you make wise economic decisions. I gave you 3 illustrative problems just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things we'll be talking about in this class. You will be able to solve these problems using the principles and the procedures we talk about in this class. In fact, about halfway through the course, you ought to be able to solve those 3 problems. We talked about the course objectives, and finally we concluded with 3 basic principles that will apply throughout the remainder of the course. Sometimes our application of these principles will be very straightforward and very, very obvious. Sometimes it may be much more subtle. Nonetheless, these 4 basic principles provide the foundation for doing an engineering economy study.